Hi, and welcome to part 4, the concluding part of our series on an unthinkable controversy, the Satmar Rebbe and the State of Israel. Until now, what we've done so far is we've looked at the centrality of the State of Israel in the religious lives of most Jews. The fact that for Satmar, the State of Israel is rejected as being not only not a positive historical development, but actually is preventing the Messianic redemption. We took a look at the underpinnings intellectually of that position, in particular by taking a look at the 3 Shavuos, the 3 oaths that are recorded in the Talmud in the Tractate of Kesuvos. And we took, by looking at those 3 oaths, we asked several questions most recently in our most recent class, which is, why is it that the authorities who are teaching this are authorities who lived in the 3rd century of the Common Era? This could have been taught easily by earlier authorities, such as significant series of oaths that the Jewish people took. And we mentioned the Bar Kokhba problem, which is that in 130 of the Common Era, Bar Kokhba did exactly what the 3 oaths said he shouldn't have done. So, did the oaths only apply after the Bar Kokhba rebellion? Hard done. Did Bar Kokhba and therefore Rabbi Akiva and the other rabbis who supported Bar Kokhba, did they do the wrong thing? Perhaps. These are questions that we dealt with. To understand the fatal flaw in the Satmar position of the 3 oaths and the rejection of the State of Israel, we actually need to understand the rabbinic reactions after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. The Bar Kokhba rebellion was very different than the war at the end of the second Temple period, for example. The Bar Kokhba rebellion was an utter disaster for the Jewish people in the land of Israel. When it was over, tens of thousands had been killed. The Romans had been particularly brutal in putting down this uprising, an uprising which they had struggled with mightily. And this attempt to bring the Messianic age through this particular rebellion clearly failed. It was a disaster. As a result of that, what we're going to see is that the rabbis make a conscious decision to move away from rebellion, away from armed resistance in retaking the land of Israel, towards a much more passive view of waiting for God to bring the Messianic era. Let me demonstrate by taking a look at Hanukkah. Hanukkah, it's a perfect example actually. Let's review the story of Hanukkah. About 135 before the Common Era, the Hasmoneans defeat the Greeks, they retake the temple, they rededicate the temple. It's a wonderful time. Wonderful. As a result of that, we have the holiday of Hanukkah, which is described as follows in the Talmud. I'm going to read to you a selection from the Talmud. It's up on your screen as well. My Hanukkah, the Gemara asks, what is Hanukkah? I'm sticking with the bold type as much as possible. The sages taught, on the 25th of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah are 8. One may not eulogize on them and one may not fast on them. Okay, what's the reason for these days? When the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all of the oils that were in the sanctuary. And when the Hasmonean monarchy overcame and emerged victorious over them, they searched and found only 1 cruse of oil that was placed with the seal of the high priest. And there was to light for only 1 day. A miracle occurred and they lit for 8 days. From it, 8 days. The next year, the sages instituted those days and made them holidays with Hallel and Thanksgiving. This is the story of Hanukkah, the miracle of the oil. We light the menorah. This is what happened on Hanukkah. This is why we have Hanukkah. In later years, as it says here, the next year it says here, next year, later years, either way, they made the holiday of Hanukkah, and the holiday of Hanukkah has 2 elements. Hallel, we know what Hallel is, that's easy, and Hoda'ah. Hoda'ah here, which means literally Thanksgiving, Hoda'ah is the prayer of Al Hanisim that on Hanukkah, and for that matter Purim, but on Hanukkah, we recite in our Amidah, we recite in our Birkat HaMazon, in our benching, right? Al Hanisim. So what's the story here? Again, the Hasmoneans defeated the Greeks. There was a big miracle with the oil. God made a big miracle happen. Hanukkah. The difficulty with this retelling of the story is that it doesn't jive very well with Al-Anisim. Al-Anisim tells a very different story. At least the emphasis is completely different. It actually tells almost a completely different story. I'm reading to you now. It'll be up on your screen as well in translation. I'm reading to you from the English translation in the Art Scroll Siddur of Al-Anisim. In the days of Matisyahu, the son of Yochanan, the high priest, the Hasmonean, and his sons, when the wicked Greek kingdom rose up against your people Israel to make them forget your Torah and compel them to stray from the statutes of your will, you in your great mercy stood up for them in the time of distress. You took up their grievance, judged their claims, and avenged their wrong. You delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and the wanton into the hands of diligent students of your Torah. For yourself you made a great and holy name in your world, and for your people Israel you worked a great victory and salvation as this very day. Thereafter your children came to the temple, came to the house. Your children came to the Holy of Holies of your house, cleansed your temple, purified the site of your holiness, and kindled lights in the courtyards of your sanctuary. And they established these 8 days of Hanukkah to express thanks and praise to your great name. What's the story of Hanukkah? There was a war, and God, in his mercy, took up our side, helped us defeat the enemy, and then after the enemy was defeated, we came to the temple, we purified the temple, we kindled lights in the courtyard, which is interesting in its own right, because that's not where the menorah was, and we established a holiday. What's missing in this story that you would expect? I mean, right? Hanukkah, we saw in the Talmud, Hanukkah, story of the miracle of the oil. The miracle of the oil is not mentioned here at all. It mentions that they lit lights. There's a midrash, actually, an interesting midrash. I think it's a midrash. It's either a Talmud, Yerushalmi, or a midrash, either way. Right? There's a midrash which says that when they got to the temple, they stuck spears in the ground and they lit them, which was a sign of their victory over the Greeks. The miracle of the oil is not mentioned here, and it's certainly not the emphasis. The emphasis here clearly is the military victory. Why is that? So let's keep in mind that this prayer was written, 200 years before the destruction of the temple. This prayer was written. The Bar Kokhba rebellion is still 60 plus years away. So we're a long, long way from the Bar Kokhba rebellion. What I would submit to you is as follows. The rabbis after the Bar Kokhba rebellion made a very conscious decision to de-emphasize military resistance and to emphasize reliance on God and God's miracles. This was a reasonable course to take, because further resistance against the Romans was going to lead to truly the end. It would be even worse than Bar Kokhba. It was time to stop resisting. Bar Kokhba was a failure. Rabbi Akiva's rebellion was a failure. We're now going to switch strategies. We're changing our approach. We're going to be much more pacifist. We're going to rely upon the miracles of God and God to bring the redemption. As a result of that, although the Al-Anisim prayer, which was in existence long before this and not therefore easily edited, it was already part of the liturgy, the Al-Anisim prayer accurately reflects the way that the rabbis and the people reacted to the miracles of Hanukkah, and in particular the military victory over the Greeks of Hanukkah. This Al-Anisim is a much more accurate retelling of that reaction. What we have in the Gemara is that, along with the many miracles that happened in the temple, which are recorded in the second book of Maccabees extensively, one of the miracles was the miracle of the oil, which was a perfect fit for what the rabbis wanted to do, which was to shift from emphasis on military resistance and the military victory and shift to the spiritual message only, because we want now to rely on God and no more resistance. So in order to switch the message, the Gemara gives a very different message, and that message has really become our commonly heard message, which is that it's a holiday where God did a big miracle for us. We have to wait. God will do miracles for us. Just rely on God. But the military aspects were completely downplayed. I think we're dealing with exactly the same thing when it comes to the three oaths and the Satmar position on Israel. The three oaths were taught in the 3rd century of the Common Era, 100 years, almost certainly 100 years after Bar Kokhba, because they reflected a new reality. The three oaths are not to be taken literally as King Solomon adjured the Jewish people as if that event truly happened, but rather the three oaths are a rabbinic reaction to the loss of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And therefore, what they say is, look, don't rebel against the nations of the world. Don't come back to the land of Israel by force. Not to worry, the nations of the world won't overly oppress you. This is an exact reaction to the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which was a rebellion against the nations of the world. It was a rebellion against Rome and an attempt to take the land of Israel by force. And as a result of that, the persecution was, excessive. So in order to address that, what the rabbi said was as follows. Don't try to retake the land of Israel. Don't rebel against the nations of the world. And for that matter, not to worry, the nations of the world won't overly oppress you. You'll be able to survive and deal with whatever oppression that there is. This is a rabbinic reaction to a political reality that took place in the 2nd century of the Common Era. The Shalosh Shvuos are essentially a drasha. They're a drasha. The rabbi, on Shabbos morning, I don't know, I want to talk about, some policy that's been implemented by the European Union, right? So what do? I open up the Torah portion and I find something in the Torah portion which seems to say, or somewhere in the Torah or somewhere in the Talmud, I find something which talks about why this is an evil, and then I say, oh, look, we see this is the Torah idea speaking exactly to this point. That's what the rabbis are doing here with the Shalosh Shvuos. What they're doing is they're saying, look, we have a new policy. We need to address this new policy and propagate this new policy. But how are we going to propagate it? We need some basis on which to propagate it. Not a problem. I've got these three oaths that Solomon adjured the Jewish people to take. I'll make those three oaths, even though in context it's very hard to see how what Solomon is saying there has anything to do with the three oaths and the rebellion of Bar Kokhba and the Jewish people and their future and messianic aspirations, etc. But I've got three oaths here. Great. I've got three oaths that I want the Jewish people to take. Three oaths. Obviously, they weren't really oaths. This never happened. There wasn't some great synod in which everybody gathered together, the Jewish people gathered together and they took their oaths, and then the nations of the world gathered together and they took their oaths. These are not things that happened. Okay? What you have is the rabbi setting forward a new policy, a political policy, if you will, of non-resistance. This policy was a perfect fit for the Satmar Rebbe. Why? And others. There again, I want to be clear. The Satmar Rebbe is not the only one who rejected the state of Israel and talked about the three oaths, etc. The rabbinic leadership at that time was dealing with a Zionist movement that was overwhelmingly, beyond overwhelmingly secular. And people who were being drawn to Zionism were being drawn away from a Torah lifestyle. So it was time to revive the three oaths. Let's push the three oaths. Let's remind people that what they are doing, Zionism, is against the will of God, as clearly expressed in the Torah. Except that it was never the will of God. God didn't come down and say to the Jewish people, Solomon didn't make them take an oath. Rather, it was a necessity of the time, a political necessity of the time, to take a path of non-resistance, non-military resistance. Okay? Once Zionism reared its head in the late 19th and early 20th century and was overwhelmingly the province of non-observant Jews, so the Satmar Rebbe and others, the Satmar Rebbe said, listen, these guys are violating the oaths, it's a disaster, or it caused a disaster, or it will cause a disaster. They're violating these oaths. You're not allowed to do these things. I don't understand. Rabbi Akiva was allowed. Bar Kokhba was allowed. There was a whole rebellion that happened. They were allowed to do it, even though King Solomon predates them by hundreds of years. So if the oaths were in place, they couldn't have done it. They did it. Why? Because the Shalosh Shavuos didn't exist before Bar Kokhba. The Shalosh Shavuos are a rabbinic framing of a new policy of not resisting actively against the occupation of the land of Israel, not taking the land of Israel by force, not rebelling against the nations of the world. Anti-Zionism in the religious community today is truly the result of not seeing text in context, not seeing the Shalosh Shavuos for what they were, a reaction to a new reality, and applying an old reality, these 3 Shavuos, applying this to a modern reality, Zionism, without taking note of the fact that it was originally a policy based on the realities of those times, and the realities of our times were, in Europe, the realities were very different. We had an opportunity to retake the land of Israel with the consent of the nations of the world, potentially. We went and resettled the land of Israel, and if you say to me, you're violating the Shalosh Shavuos, I'll just say to you, I follow Rabbi Akiva. The Shalosh Shavuos, really, at the end of the day, the Shalosh Shavuos were a rabbinic political platform, and that rabbinic political platform was good for its time, but it's not necessarily good for ours. And as a matter of fact, as Zionism clearly proved by being victorious and giving the Jewish people a place to go and a nation to build, and giving the Jewish people hope at the end of after the Holocaust, and giving the Jewish people hope and energy throughout the last part of the 20th and early part of the 21st century, Zionism has been proved right. Zionism has been proved to be the right policy. I'll elaborate on that much more in my Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut message. That will be coming your way, God willing, tomorrow. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for taking the time to understand this important controversy. And we look forward to being with you again for our special Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut message.